I now give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Madam President, thank you. First of all, I would like to express our condolences to you, the U.S. mission, and all of the U.S. people for the horrendous tragedy and crime that took place in Texas, the killing of innocent people and primarily children, and also the crime that was carried out previously based on hatred. Unfortunately, this also pertains to the protection of civilians, although not in the context of armed conflicts. Madam President, we welcome our briefers to our customary May debate on the protection of civilians in armed conflict. Last year, the UN Security Council adopted two important resolutions, 2573 on the protection of civilian infrastructure and facilities, and 2601 on the protection of schools and education in armed conflict. The international community continues to expand its arsenal of international instruments to ensure respect for international humanitarian law and the protection of civilians. The UN Secretary-General's annual report paints a full picture of the status of civilians in armed conflict. We are pleased that after the withdrawal of American troops last summer from Afghanistan, the situation in the country drastically improved. Unfortunately, in the first half of 2021, when there was still US forces in Afghanistan, a tragic record was achieved. More than 5,000 Afghans were killed or injured. The report also rightly highlights the significant civilian losses in Nigeria, the DRC, and also Syria. As regards Syria, there have been significant successes in combating international terrorism. However, establishing fully fledged peace and stability in that country is hindered by the illegal occupation by the US of a significant part of the territory of that state. In the occupied territories, there are still camps with inhumane living conditions for civilians, and havoc and total impunity reign. Furthermore, the occupying power blatantly has plundered natural and agricultural resources that belong to the people of Syria. The US is expanding its smuggling and illicit trade in oil and grain. This, as we understand it, is the recipe for how to combat the global energy and food crisis according to the American way. Furthermore, despite the protracted serious humanitarian situation in Syria coupled with the economic crisis, the US and the EU are continuing to use illegal unilateral sanctions against the long-suffering Syrian people, and these sanctions have catastrophic consequences. Madam President, contemporary international humanitarian law is something which was hard fought as the result of two world wars. It's a code of conduct for warring parties. Russia was involved in the creation of this branch of international law and is unswervingly guided by its principles. In contrast to the methods which destroy the enemy and civilians during the NATO military action in Yugoslavia, Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria, the current special military operation conducted by Russia in Ukraine fully adheres to the lofty goal of protecting the lives of civilians held hostage by the Kiev regime. The special operation has shed the spotlight on how cynical and criminal the actions of the Kiev authorities and their armed forces are, as are their nationalist formations. Russia and authoritative NGOs are carefully recording Kiev's crimes. The issue of responsibility is just a question of time. However, the US and its allies not only are turning a blind eye to Kiev's crimes against civilians, but in fact are accomplices in the murder of civilians. The shelling of civilian towns in Donbass uses howitzers supplied by Washington. The Ukrainian army regularly positions their posts in schools and hospitals. For example, the Lysychansk General Hospital, where on the second and third floors there are Ukrainian army machine gun crews located, the Kharkov Oblast Children's Hospital, the Kharkovsk Municipal Hospital number 3, and the Volnovakh Central Hospital. This is not an exhaustive list. the shelling of the civilians by Ukraine happens on a daily basis. There is an enormous amount of witnesses to this, and the Ukrainians seem to have no regard whatsoever for their own compatriots. Distinguished colleagues, talking about the protection of civilians, we cannot fail to mention the speculation and manipulation of public opinion that is swirling around this topic. We regularly talk about such occurrences in our statements. The most glaring example of this is the egregious Ukrainian provocation in Bucha, which was splashed over the world's media at the beginning of April. 2 days ago, during the Security Council meeting on information technology, the UK representative tried to cast doubt on our conclusions on the staged nature of the Bucha provocation, referring to the satellite images published by the New York Times. If we're to believe them, then the corpses in the Bucha streets apparently were there and were visible from the satellite from the 11th of March. Now, I'm not going to talk about the dubious nature of these images. We have not yet had the opportunity to corroborate their authenticity because the Macha company does not sell its product in Russia. We believe that the images are authentic, and the bodies that the Ukrainian correspondents photographed on the streets of Bucha on the 3rd of April had indeed been lying there since the 11th of March. However, the situation was somewhat different. Then there's the question, why in the April images are there no signs of the bodies decomposing? According to weather reports, the temperature in the town at that time was 16 degrees Celsius. Any even fledgling forensic pathologist will tell you that by the end of the second week, a corpse not only is decomposing but is turning black. The bodies that the Ukrainians showed us all showed no signs of decomposition. This just means one thing: the New York Times assertions are fallacious, they're lies. Our British colleagues said a great deal more in their statement. However, we will respond to them in detail shortly, including through social media. I'd like to point out that eyewitness to the inconsistencies of the Ukrainian provocation in Bucha are trying to challenge, in fact, the British, who, when they were president of the Security Council, twice rejected our request to conduct a meeting precisely to discuss this provocation. A guilty mind is never at ease. Furthermore, it's very noteworthy that our Western colleagues swiftly cooled off in banging on about the provocation in Kramatorsk. There, after the shelling of the railway station by Ukrainian forces on the 8th of April, more than 50 civilians were killed. Ukraine carried out this false flag operation too clumsily, and it was too obvious that Ukraine in fact carried it out. I'd like to draw your attention also to the torture and abuse by Ukrainian nationalists and the Ukrainian army of Ukrainian soldiers who are prisoners of war. Many Ukrainian soldiers, prisoners of war, have confessed that they had orders to shoot civilians and not to take Russian soldiers prisoner. In turn, for the Russian armed forces, a humane treatment of prisoners of war is the norm. Proof of this is our treatment of those who recently surrendered, these Ukrainian soldiers and Ukrainian nationalists from the notorious Azov battalion who left the Azovstal factory complex. As you know, 2,439 people from different Ukrainian units surrendered. All soldiers and their commanders were treated with respect, and the injured received medical assistance. This is not they themselves are confirming this, and their relatives who we're allowing them to contact. We are talking, furthermore, about people, including these fighters, who have been tainted by carrying out the most heinous war crimes. All those who've perpetrated deliberate attacks against civilians or who were responsible for their deaths as a result of indiscriminate or disproportionate use of force and are violating international humanitarian law will face justice.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement, and I